Hello again, everyone. Edwin Learnard back once again. In this YouTube astrological segment, I'm going to be talking about Horary Astrology. Well, anyway, the first thing as far as Horary Astrology goes, well, this is about when you're trying to ascertain the answer to something based on drawing up a chart, astrology chart, at the precise time and date that the question was asked, and finding out through that chart now what the answer may be. Now let's go over at least a couple things as far as what certain things are in the chart. Now, the querent, that is the person asked, the individual that has the question, and it's represented by the first house cusp in the horary chart that is drawn up. Now, the quesited, that is the question itself. This is the cusp of the house related or pertaining to the question. Now, for example, let's say this was a question pertaining to marriage. Now, a significant other, this would be the 7th house. If it's a health-related issue, then that would be the 6th house cusp. Something connected with an inheritance, the 8th house cusp. So anyway, another thing the thing that you're going to look at, I mean, there's a lot of nuances in horary astrology, and I'm not going to be able to get into all of it. It's very intricate. It's got a lot of exceptions and stipulations connected with it, but I'm going to try to give you a basic rundown on reading a horary chart. Now, what you do is you're going to take the ruler or significator of the querent and the quesited, and what you're going to do is you're going to see if it makes a major aspect in the chart. It is imperative it makes one. It has to make a major aspect of it, otherwise it's null and void. Now, if it makes a positive aspect, now then that means you could have a rather auspicious answer to your question. Now, don't think, well, if it makes, let's say if it makes an adverse aspect, if it makes a square opposition or even an inconjunct. Now, this could be, it doesn't necessarily mean the answer is like a no, depending on the question. It just could simply mean there might be some complications or some obstacles you may run into, or the answer is not going to be nearly as advantageous as what you'd like it to be. Now, also keep in mind that the aspect must be applying and not separating. Now, let me get back to the thing about if it's an adverse aspect. Now, let's say if it does make let's say there's a square, for example, between the ruler of the querent and the ruler of the quesited in the horary chart. Well, the thing about that is, let's say the question was pertaining to a vehicle. Let's say you're trying to locate a car, and of course, if your car is gone, it's obviously been stolen. Unless it's repossessed, of course, that could be another issue, but most of the time it would be stolen. So let's say there is a negative aspect between that ruler of the question house, the quesited, and the ruler of the querent, the first house. Now, if there is a negative aspect made between them, it might simply mean you might not find the car in the condition it was, for example, as opposed to when you had it. It might have gotten damaged. Maybe if, let's say that if Mars was involved in the aspect, there could have been maybe an accident. Maybe the person was trying to get away from the police, as an example, or if something happened to it. Let's say even if Pluto was involved in the aspect, could be Pluto's about transformation. Maybe this person tried to do something to the car, to change something on it in order as a cover-up to So you wouldn't be able to determine that it was your vehicle, or no one would be able, or in a means to cover up the fact that the car was actually stolen. That they make it look like a car that wasn't, give it a new appearance, so people won't be able to find it. So anyway, another thing to keep in mind too is, now as far as the time goes, on a horary chart, you have to, if it's in, let's say that the ruler of the querent, the ruler or significator of the first house, if it's located in, let's say, an angular house and a cardinal sign, then it could likely be days when, in terms of getting that answer to whatever is you're asking. Now, the longest period would be, let's say, if it is in a, if it's in a ruler of the querent is in a mutable sign and a cadent house. Now, you could be looking at years if that is the case, and also, as far as a more precise time, well, you're going to look at the amount of degrees from the exact aspect, in that aspect that it makes. So let's say that let's say it's a square, or no, let's go, for example, let's say a sextile aspect is made between the ruler of the querent and the quaesited. Well, let's say it's 3 degrees from an exact aspect. Let's say it's either 57 degrees or 63 degrees. Well, and let's say it's in a cardinal sign and an angular house. Well, you could be looking at 3 days, because 1 degree would equal 3 days. Now, as another example, let's say that it was in a mutable, the ruler of the querent was in a mutable sign, and it was also in a cadent house. Now, let's say it's 2 degrees from an exact aspect. Now, as far as the ruler of the querent and the ruler of the quaesited, if the ruler of the querent is in a mutable sign and cadent house, and it's, let's say it's 3 degrees from the exact aspect, then you could be looking at 3 years to get the resolution, or to get that, get that answer. So anyway, another thing to look at is there are things called strictures and considerations of judgment. And what that is there's certain things to look at, even if you have a major aspect between the ruler of the querent and quaesited in this horary chart. There's things that can at the very least make you really proceed with a lot of prudence and go forward with caution. It may not be, you may not really be able to get that answer that you really want in some of these instances. It makes at least diminishes the chances, I believe, of it being that favorable. Or now, if you look at, let's say, for example, though, some of the strictures or considerations before judgment. Let's say you look at the first house cusp of this horary chart, and if it's between 0 degrees and 2 degrees and 59 minutes of arc, well, that's generally going to be very early, and might be too early to ask the question. It can show a rather impetuous or impatient person that's asking this, or they might be in too much of a hurry to ask it, and they didn't, maybe it wasn't thought over before the question was asked. Either, no matter how you look at it, it could very well be that it's too early is what it means. It may be too early to ask the question. Now, let's say that, on the other hand, if the cusp of the first house by degrees is between 27 degrees 1 minute of arc in a sign and 29 degrees, 59 minutes of arc in a sign, well, that could indicate that it could be too late to ask the question, and it may be, the person may get an answer, but it might leave them feeling devastated or very despondent. So that's another thing. Now, another stricture or consideration before judgment is if the moon is via combusta, and that is between 15 degrees, if the moon is between 15 degrees Libra and 15 degrees Scorpio. This is attributed to having a number of nefarious / malefic stars in that grouping, in that interval between 15 degrees Libra and 15 degrees Scorpio. And the persons, that their state of mind, they might be rather exasperated and agitated during this time. So that could make it where it could be difficult. It might not be the best period for them to be asking and getting an answer. So, and last but not least, another thing to consider as far as a stricture consideration before judgment is if Saturn is in the 7th house in the Horary chart. Because if Saturn is in the 7th house, this indicates that the astrologer's judgment might be obscured somewhat during this time, and might not be able to competently decipher this chart as far as the question, answering the question goes. So those are some things to look at. But as I stated before, though, you're going to have to, if you want to find out more extensive, detailed information pertaining to Horary astrology and charts, I would suggest you Google it or get Google a book on it or something online, because there are just so many little nuances and stipulations connected with this and exceptions. I'm just giving a general idea and give people a general conception idea of what they do in terms of trying to decipher a Horary chart and understand it and delineate it. And there's certain other things to look at, like for example, such as let's say if you're ruler of the querent and the ruler of the quesidid, if they're in the same, if they have the same ruler on it, which could be possible, because let's say that if you you drew up the Horary chart, and let's say that Taurus was rising, Taurus was on the 1st house cusp, and let's say this was a health or work related question, and you had Libra on the cusp of the 6th, they both be ruled by Venus. So you have to, it'll tell you what to do as far as by default, what would you use in terms of what would be Venus be used with in terms of, because obviously you can't have an aspect between the same planet. So you understand what I'm saying. What I gave in this video is just a very general way to really delineate, analyze a Horary chart. Now, the last thing I want to get at as far as this goes, let's say if you're trying to understand a Horary chart, I should say you're trying to resolve a question and you've been persistent, whether you've asked a few times, which a lot of people don't think you should do, but let's say you're one of those persistent people and you asked a few times at least, and you had Saturn in the 7th on one occasion, and then something else happened another time. It was you had the moon in via combusta between 15 degrees Libra and 15 degrees Scorpio, and you just kept trying and you weren't able to do anything. Well, my suggestion is anyway to go look at transits and progressions. Let's say you had a question that was pertaining to marriage, right? Now, and you weren't able to resolve anything after a few attempts through the Horary astrology process. Now, and let's say if you had transit, if you were trying to see if it was time, you wanted to pop the question, so to speak, and ask, you wanted to ask, if you want to find out if it was the right time to ask someone him or her to marry you. And if you had a lot of favorable auspicious transits in your chart, for example, let's say Jupiter was in your 7th house and it made predominantly good aspects, especially if you can get a sextile or trine, let's say to Venus and or Mercury, something like that, it could be very favorable. So you don't necessarily have to be dependent on Horary Astrology, and I really actually recommend really looking at transits a little bit more, because you could there's so many things in a Horary chart that could make this thing either make the chart invalid or void, so to speak, and you might be really trying to get these answers, and you might take you a while to actually number of chart drawings through a lot of persistence and patience, which a lot of people often don't have. It may take a lot in order for you to derive at the answer that you're trying to get. So my suggestion is actually, if you can, try to go to transits and look at them. If you're trying to see something for perhaps future events, or trying to get an answer to something that is pending, something that's how I would do it anyway. And even progressions you can look at. Transits generally, are going to go faster, so than progressions. I would look more at the progressions can be good for things that are long-term, because progressions do take a while to move from a lot of times from one house to the next, and you could have, especially when you have slower moving planets, the personal planets go through houses quicker, and you might be able to get that answer, and at least get a general idea of some conception as far as that answer goes quicker in terms of transits, I believe. So answer to what you're trying to find out. Well, anyway, people, that'll conclude this YouTube astrological segment for Horary Astrology, and stay tuned next time, where I'll be continuing my series on the Juno in the signs. 2 things I want to get with you on before I head out. Firstly, the stars may impel but do not compel, and secondly, never isolate any single astrological element, aspect, planetary placement, position, configuration, influence, or what have you, and make an analysis of a person, astrologically speaking, based on this alone, because astrologically speaking, the person is the sum of all their components in their natal chart, and not just one. Until next time, people, stay well.